Hello, my name is Gauri Kambhatla, and I'll be presenting our work on surfacing racial stereotypes through identity portrayal, which is joint work with Stewart and Rada Mihalcea at the University of Michigan. Before continuing, I'd like to emphasize that this presentation discusses content that may be offensive or upsetting. So I don't need to tell you that racial stereotyping occurs through language. This is something we're all aware of. But this has been shown more precisely in various domains, from something as seemingly innocuous as sports commentary, in which Murillo et al. Show that black players are mostly praised for athleticism, while white players are mostly praised for their personality or intelligence. All the way to the more dangerous domain of policing, where Voigt et al. Show that black community members are much more likely to hear a disrespectful utterance, such as hands on the wheel, while white community members are more likely to hear something more respectful, like expressing reassurance. So the problems we just discussed result from implicit bias and stereotypes in language, where the speaker or author doesn't intentionally mean to cause harm. However, these can still lead to serious consequences, such as wrongful imprisonment, or at a smaller scale, microaggressions, which can be detrimental to physical and mental health at the individual level, resulting in illnesses like anxiety and depression. So we know stereotypes are potentially bad, but how can we detect them? And how can we do so computationally to be able to detect stereotypes at a large scale? Previous work studies similar questions in numerous ways, which we will not discuss here, but in this work we explore this question by looking at linguistic features that are associated with differences in what we call racial identity portrayal. So what does this actually mean? More concretely, we study this through three research questions. First, we ask whether we can differentiate between an author portraying themselves and the same author portraying a different racial identity. With this question, we seek to explore what stereotypes people of specific racial groups make. Second, we ask whether we can predict the true racial identity of an author, given a response that is supposedly of a particular identity. With this research question, we aim to identify the stereotypes that individuals have about specific racial groups. And third, we ask to what degree the actual differences in language use between people of different racial identities reflect any known stereotypes. So to answer these questions, we first collect data from participants using the Prolific platform. We end up with a total of 615 participants after filtering responses. We focus here on two racial identities, black and white, and two gender identities, men and women, although we'd like to see this extended in future work. We only take responses from participants within the United States to limit cultural bias, and the number of participants for each racial identity group are shown here. So we ask participants two broad questions. In the first, we ask them simply to describe themselves. This question is purposefully open-ended to give participants the opportunity to discuss what they feel is important. In the second prompt, we ask participants to describe their evening after a workday. We then ask participants to answer both of these questions as if they were of a different racial identity. And so we hypothesized that the first question might expose stereotypes about concepts like personality and identity, while the second question might expose stereotypes about concepts like home life and occupation. So to make the setting more clear, basically if a participant self-identifies as, for example, a black woman, she answers the prompts both as herself, and we call this the real identity response, and as if she were a white woman, which we call the portrayed identity response. So note that between the different identities, the gender remains constant, so we never have something like a white man portraying a black woman. And we do this because we are focusing on racial identity portrayal, and we don't want the confound of gender. So here's a partial response from one of our participants who self-identified as a black woman. In the real response, she describes herself, her family, and her occupation. And in the portrayed response, she describes herself as a Southern soccer mom and continues to describe her family and physical appearance. So now that we have an idea of what the data looks like, let's go back to our research questions. We'll skip over the first question for the sake of time. But what we found was that yes, we can distinguish between an author writing as themselves and as a different racial identity with up to almost 85% accuracy, and that white authors write significantly more different as black individuals than the other way around. More details about the significance of this can be found in the paper. So our second research question looks at, given a response that is supposedly written by someone of a certain racial identity, can we determine whether or not it actually is? So now we have text that's written by people of different racial identities, and the goal is to predict an author's true racial identity, which is a simple binary classification task. So in this setting, we're performing a classification between the same racial identities for multiple participants, and we are attempting to determine whether the response is real or portrayed. So for example, if we have a response that's supposedly written by a black woman, the classifier must predict the true racial identity of the author. In order to do this classification, we first take the text responses from each participant and extract some linguistic features, which we can then input into a classifier. So in this case, we use a simple linear support vector machine. The classifier then outputs a prediction for each response. We also experimented with more powerful classifiers, but we achieved similar results and chose the SVM for interpretability. So let's look at what linguistic features we extracted. To determine what features to use, we think about what aspects of language may help detect racial stereotypes. So we look at individual word features like engrams, term frequency, inverse document frequency, and Luke lexicon semantic features. We also look at semantic features like word-to-vec embeddings, as well as style features like lexical diversity and readability. And more information about these features can be found in the paper. So here are the results from the classification experiment. The baseline we use here is majority class, and each row represents an SVM using that row's features for the classification. This table shows accuracy scores where all values are significantly different from the baseline with a p-value of less than 0.001. So the portrayed black and portrayed white columns here indicate accuracy scores in the setting where the model is given a response that is supposedly from a black or white author. There's a lot of numbers on here, but I'd like to emphasize that these numbers are all very high given the simplicity of the model that we used. However, the style features did not perform better than the baseline, and so we won't include those in the analysis. For the vast majority, the SVM performs much better for portrayed black identities than it does for portrayed white ones. So the ones in green versus the ones in blue, in 15 out of 18 of the settings shown here, and by an average of about 5.6%. So what does this actually mean? This indicates that it's easier to identify a white author posing as a black author than the other way around, or in other words, black participants can more accurately depict white authors, which could indicate that our data contains more stereotypes about black individuals. We explore this next by analyzing some of the features themselves. So this leads us to our third research question, about differences in actual word usage between racial identities. To answer this question, we find the top 10 most predictive linguistic features associated with author prediction, which was the test that we just discussed. And by most predictive features, we mean the features with the highest weights, or the ones that are most relevant in the author prediction task. We perform our analysis based on two sets of features. First, we look at word-level features using TF-IDF. And second, we look at category features, looking at the Luke lexicon. So for the sake of time, we will not discuss the category level feature analysis, but this can be found in the paper. So let's talk about the word level features. We categorize our word features into these four broad categories: appearance, interests, residence, and identity, based on a qualitative analysis of top features. We'll show some of those here. So here's a selection of the most predictive features. I won't talk about everything on here, but there's more discussion in the paper about the weights of each word, the number and context of use in the participants' responses, and other details. Here, the green circles are words that are most predictive of black participants writing as white participants, and the blue circles are the converse. The lighter circles are predictive of black or white participants writing as themselves. So as you can see, a lot of the most predictive features are common stereotypes, like basketball when talking about black individuals, or Starbucks when talking about white individuals. But for the sake of time, I'll focus only on a few words of interest, particularly those related to the identity category, from which we see some interesting patterns. While these features are not stereotypes per se, they highlight some interesting conceptualizations about the self. So some of the predictive words of white participants portraying black participants relate to what they perceive as important to a black identity, such as race, hard, and college. As shown in some of these examples, this gives us an idea of what white participants think is worth discussing in the life of a black person, or the attributes that are highly visible to white individuals, either in their own lives or through media. In addition, white men include the word white while writing from the perspective of black men, evoking a sense of other. So, for example, I did not get along much with the white kids. And this illuminates how white men believe black men see people of their own racial identity. And indeed, prior work has shown that white individuals are aware that racial minorities see them as more prejudiced or close-minded. Similar to white being predictive of white men writing as black men, black is predictive of black men writing as white men, mostly used in the context of bias against themselves. So for example, I hate to deal with the black employees. And this kind of elucidates how black men believe the stereotypical white man sees them. Finally, African American are top features when black participants write as themselves, used in the context of I am African American, but we do not see anything corresponding with white participants, such as I am white or Caucasian. And this agrees with sociology studies that show that white participants have a lower salience of racial identity. So recall that with the prompts we chose, we aimed to surface stereotypes about some of these highlighted concepts. And we found that the most predictive TF-IDF features fell into 4 main categories that incorporate many of the types of stereotypes we were trying to surface. So to summarize what we found, we've already kind of discussed what we found through this first question. But this is paralleled with our results for the second question, in which we find that we can predict the true identity of an author with up to almost 90% accuracy, and it is significantly easier to do so when the supposed identity is black than when it is white, once again showing that white participants are less accurate in portraying black identities than vice versa. Finally, we show that the differences in language use between people of different racial identities reveal stereotypes related to appearance, identity, home life, and interests, highlighting some known stereotypes like basketball and Starbucks, while also revealing interesting conceptualizations of the self and how this relates to racial identity. So why is this work important? As one example, consider the situation of bad faith actors in online discussions, such as bots or humans who spread misinformation online by acting as a member of a minority community. Our classifiers might be able to help identify such agents by determining whether or not the content was written by a real person of the minority group or an actor portraying such a person, which can be beneficial in limiting the spread of misinformation. So we'd like to highlight that there's some important limitations to this work. Our results might not fully disentangle deception from racial identity. So in other words, the classification might be relying on features that are related to participants pretending to be a different person entirely, rather than specifically a different racial identity. In addition, we'd like to note that our results here represent a single snapshot of stereotypes that may be different from those that emerge in everyday language. And third, we'd like to emphasize that this data set is not intended to be used to train NLP models that can generate harmful stereotypes. So this work is merely a starting point in examining methods of surfacing racial stereotypes and biases. However, in this work, we created a novel dataset of stereotypes through racial identity portrayal, developed an experimental methodology for surfacing stereotypes in text with applications to real-world settings, and we conducted an analysis of linguistic features associated with stereotypes of different racial identities, confirming common stereotypes and highlighting conceptualizations through racial identity. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Stewart and Rada Mihalcea, for all their help with this work. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact me, and the data will be available for download. Thank you.